Between the 18th and 19th centuries, it wasn't just whips and chains that marked the lives of enslaved people, but also episodes so brutal that the colonial elite itself tried to erase them from the records. One such account is Shanice the slave, a mother who, after seeing her sick baby drowned by the lady of the manor, transformed her grief into an unthinkable act. Filled with a rage that knew no bounds, she dragged the countess by the hair, hung her from a beam, and ripped off her breasts with her bare hands. This story, shrouded in mystery and fear, lives on for generations, passing through the slave quarters as a symbol of courage and resistance. What happened that night remains shrouded in secrecy, and it is precisely this forbidden memory that we will now revisit. If this story has already moved you, know that what lies ahead is even more disturbing. Subscribe now and follow each revelation before it's too late. St. James Parish, Jamaica, 1830. Palm Grove Farm. The gong. Echoes before dawn, cutting through the salty wind blowing in from the sea. In the main house, lamps flicker. In the slave quarters, bodies rise in silence. Enslavement here isn't just forced labor. It's a clock that never stops. At 4 in the morning, feverish-eyed women tie cloths around their heads, bind their aching breasts in rough clothing, and walk to the sugarcane fields. Among them is Shanice, a young mother with slender arms and a gaze that has learned to hide tears. Her son, Kwame, has been breathing in sobs for days. Before leaving, Shanice deposits him in the nursery, a wooden cubicle adjoining the slave quarters, watched over by Aunt Ruth, an elderly woman with trembling hands. "Go, daughter," whispers Ruth. "The sun doesn't wait." The sun here is an accomplice to the lash. Palm Grove belongs to retired Captain Arthur Langley and his wife, Beatrice Langley. The foreman in the yard is Thomas Pike, his suit clad, boots always polished, his gaze calculating, and a guava stick slung over his forearm. He dictates the pace, cutting, tying, dragging, grinding. At the sugar mill, the noise of the mill drowns out voices. In the boiling house, pots boil and splash dark syrup onto arms that no longer feel straight. The bagasse dust scratches throats, the smoke numbs lungs, and backs bend until night unravels them. When someone stumbles, Pike's stick meets skin. "Rhythm!" he bellows, and the word sounds like a sentence. The ration is measured out in handfuls. Ground. Corn, salted fish with a strong odor, sometimes a few plantains, water drawn from a shallow well, cloudy in the hot months. Milk, almost never, which is why mothers lose milk early and babies get sick before they learn their own names. Diarrhea, fevers, coughs, wounds that won't heal. The children's skin becomes paper thin. Aunt Ruth boils cerasee leaves in an iron pot and shares the tea as if sharing a prayer. On moonlit nights, the women murmur songs inherited from the African coast, unable to fully remember the words, remembering only the cadence that lulls and promises endurance. In the nursery, the air is a mixture of milk, sweat, and lamplight. Abeni, Shanice's neighbor, lost 2 children in the last year. She places her hand on her friend's hair and says softly, barely moving her lips, "Breathe for him." Shanice replies in a whispered voice, "I will." Despair here is disciplined. It learns not to scream. Grief presents itself in small forms. A washed diaper laid out without a body, a makeshift crib that no longer creaks. Reclaimed wooden crates serve as coffins. The grave is shallow, dug behind the hibiscus bushes. In these hurried burials, no one gives a speech. The eyes speak. When the sun truly rises, the sugarcane cutters are already wet with sweat. Blades clink, grass snakes scurry, the ground gives off heat. Shanice's cracked hand holds the machete with the same delicacy with which she would later hold her son's head. With each bundle tied, she calculates the time for the brief midday visit to the breeding house. Midday is both a reward and a torment. A reward because she sees Kwame, a torment because she must leave again. Sometimes she finds the boy's eyes glassy, sometimes feverish. On worse days, his body refuses the shredded salted fish she softens in hot water to stave off hunger. The gentlemen call it order. Shanice calls it survival. And within this regime that aims to break the will, a kind of courage that makes no noise is born. Older, women teach shortcuts to self-care. Papaya leaves that soothe the stomach, charcoal powder that staunches diarrhea, castor oil for a persistent cough. They also teach the economy of the body, how to protect the back under load, how to wrap the cloth so the skin doesn't break, how to hide a handful of corn for the next dawn. As dusk falls, the pot still boils and the gears still chew on the bagasse. In the courtyard, Pike checks the stacked bundles. Those who stayed behind pay on the trunk, a wooden stump, an iron handle, and the dry cracking sound that the night learns to ignore. The women look away so their minds don't store another image. But memory, even when trying to protect itself, records it. In the silence of the return, each carries their inventory of losses, lost teeth, torn nails, sleep hanging by threads, the names of children who no longer respond. Sundays are a break that barely deserves the name. In theory, rest. In practice, time to climb the slopes to the provision. Grounds, small plots where they grow yams, cassava and okra, and exchange surpluses at the Montego Bay market for a nail, a piece of soap, or a red headscarf. Some return with blue beads on their wrists, mementos of an Africa that the crossing tried to dissolve. At night, rumors spread about maroon trails in cockpit country and about people who dared to disappear into the forest. Not everyone succeeds. Not everyone tries. Fear is a patient teacher. The suffering of mothers weighs especially heavily. Every child's cough, every fever that won't subside is a clock without hands. Shanice counts Kwame's breaths with her fingers as if praying. "Stay," she says, and the verb is the entire dictionary. When he falls asleep, she straightens the mat, straightens the cloth, adjusts the lamp so the wick doesn't smoke. Beatrice Langley sometimes passes through the nursery's hallway with a scented handkerchief on her face and observes from a distance, as if taking inventory of objects. Her gaze passes through, but doesn't see. In the ledger, there are production numbers. There are no baby names. With the return of dawn, the gong strikes again. The cycle begins again, as if the night had never existed. But something builds up inside Shanice. A sediment of pain that instead of paralyzing thickens. It's the courage that arises when all exits have been closed. She learns to disguise herself, to speak little, to listen a lot, to hide her signs in the folds of her cloth, to calculate the distance between the door of the puppy house and the rear exit of the slave quarters. She learns to see in the dark and to keep the map of the farm in her head, the position of the well, the angle of the mill, the shadow of the large cotton tree pointing north. All of this takes place in a world designed to break mothers, work days that dry up milk, food that doesn't sustain, illnesses that strike the little ones first, punishments that try to teach the body to give up. Yet, in this same world, science of care, passed down by word of mouth, endures, an arithmetic of survival that calculates when to remain silent and when to act. And it is in this terrain of daily brutality and quiet courage that Shanice's story unfolds, breathing with each step she takes on the sugary ground of Palm Grove, Jamaica, 1830. Here, pain isn't an end, it's breath. And breath, sooner or later, seeks an exit. We are building a community that doesn't turn its face away from the truth. Comment, "I'm a part of it," and join us. Between the rows of sugarcane, the invisible camera of time zooms in on a figure who bears more than the marks of labor. Shanice, a young black woman with dark brown skin, bears scars on her body that blend with the routine of the slave quarters, but her eyes hold a shine that resists the dirt and the lash. Her world was not made of choices, only of survival. And yet, there was a reason that kept her upright each morning. Little Kwame, her baby born special, paralyzed with a fragile body that didn't respond like others, but who, for her, was her heart beating outside her chest. In the hushed silence of the nursery, Shanice devised ways to lengthen her son's days. She hid scraps of food under his headcloth, risking punishment in the stocks, just to turn a handful of banana or a shred of salted fish into a paste that slowly dripped down his cracked lips. When fever overtook him, she improvised warm compresses with cloths soaked in the steam from the pot, cradling him against her chest, as if her own heart could lend rhythm to his short, uncertain breaths. "Stay, my sunshine. Breathe with me," she whispered, gliding her fingers over his inert body, trying to awaken movements that might never come. Every dawn, Shanice would sneak to the marshy area behind the sugar mill to gather some less murky water. She filtered it through old rags and offered it to her son as if it were liquid gold. Just one sip was enough to fill her eyes with hope. The risk was high. If the overseer caught her, the whip would follow, but for a mother, the pain in her own skin was worth less than the risk of losing her son. Around her, the other women in the slave quarters murmured chants inherited from Africa, and Shanice, even without remembering all the words, repeated the sounds to soothe Kwame's cries. The simple rhythm, tapped with her fingertips on the side of the mat, became medicine. Even exhausted, she created small exercises. She slowly bent the boy's knees, massaged his hands as they curled into fists, and pressed the soles of his feet against her own skin, as if his mother's texture could teach her what ground was. When he let out a moan, Shanice smiled, as if it were a secret dance. "Look at you dancing, my son," she murmured, and that shy laugh was enough to renew her strength the next day. It was in this bond, built between loss and danger, that Shanice found the breath to carry on. For in a world that did everything to break mothers, she had decided her arms, her voice, and her heart would be the ground where Kwame would learn to exist. Little did she know that she was already being watched by evil eyes. If Shanice's love for her son touched you, leave a like. Each like is like a heart beating with her. But that Wednesday night seemed heavier than the others. Kwame's cries echoed through the breeding house like a drum of despair, each wail piercing the silence of the farm as if announcing an inevitable tragedy. Shanice, her eyes swollen from the vigil, cradled her son in her arms, rubbing damp cloths over his feverish body and chanting softly, trying to soothe a pain she couldn't even name. Mrs. Beatrice Langley, however, had already noticed, and her coldness brooked no exceptions. To her, a slave who didn't perform was deadweight, even a child. In the early hours of the morning, Beatrice watched from the porch of the main house with a disgusted expression, her white handkerchief covering part of her face to ward off the smell. Of the slave quarters, the child's weeping seemed to insult her authority, to violate what she called order. At dawn, the men were sent to the sugarcane fields, and Shanice, exhausted, walked to the well with the gourd in her hands, leaving her son for a few minutes under the cloth that covered him on the mat. It was in that brief but fateful interval that Beatrice made the decision that would forever change the history of that place. With firm steps, she entered the nursery, lifted the baby, with her fingertips as if holding a filthy object, and walked toward the river that ran alongside the hibiscus garden. Her cold eyes did not waver. Not a shadow of compassion crossed her face. When she reached the water's edge, she lifted the child and with a swift gesture threw him into the river. The small body disappeared into the murky waves without any resistance. Across the courtyard, Shanice was returning, the gourd balanced on her head. In the distance, he saw the white flutter of Beatrice's dress, then the sudden plunge of his son's body. The water closing over Kwame was a cut to his soul. "Kwame! No!" The scream tore from his throat as if tearing his own flesh. The gourd fell, water splashed across the ground, and she ran toward the old woman, her bare feet slamming into the hard earth. Before she could reach the bank, two foremen, Hugh and Mason, appeared and grabbed her by the arms. Shanice struggled like a cornered beast, scratching, kicking, begging. "Let me get to it. It's my son! My son!" Her voice echoed through the mill, but no one dared intercede. Trapped in their strong arms, she fell to her knees, only to watch the river's whirlpools swallow up what remained of her hope. Beatrice turned to her unhurriedly. His blue eyes reflected only contempt. "I won't keep dead weight in this place," he said, his voice sharp as a blade. Then he turned and walked up the slope toward the big house, as if he'd discarded nothing more than an old rag. Shanice fell to the ground, her body arched in sobs, her face wet, whether from tears or the mud of the earth, I don't know. She screamed until her voice broke, called her son's name until she was breathless, and then she was left only moaning like a wounded animal. The overseers didn't release her until their orders came. At her mistress's command, she was dragged back to the slave quarters and locked in irons. For 2 days, she tasted neither food nor water, sitting on the cold floor, her back pressed against the mud wall. Shanice held her son's small clothing, the only thing she had left, to her chest. She wept silently, shaking the cloth as if still cradling the boy and whispering, "Forgive me, my son. Forgive me for not saving you." Her crying was both a prayer and a lament, and the women of the slave quarters outside listened and wept with her, unable to approach. At Palm Grove Farm, the rumor spread quickly, but no one dared speak out loud. What had happened to that child would never be recorded in any book, but it was etched on Shanice's body and in the heavy silence that hung over every worker. The river, which had flowed serenely in the eyes of the masters, came to be remembered as the unmarked grave of a baby ripped from life by the cruelty of a discipline-obsessed woman. If this scene tore you apart, write in the comments, "Justice for Shanice." I want to see how many voices rise up against such cruelty. After 3 days in the darkness of the slave quarters, they dragged Shanice back into the light, as if they could revive her with orders and work. She came silent, her lips worn, her eyes hollow from sleepless nights. No more tears could represent what had already broken inside her. As she was pushed to the cutting line, she heard Foreman Mason, in the rough voice she knew well, prod, "Go, nigger. One less burden you've lifted from our backs." The words fell like gravel. Hugh chuckled softly, as if confirming a destiny. It seemed they wanted to see her bleed until nothing was left. But the blood she held was different, not what she could spill, but the fire that consumed her inside, a desire for revenge that grew daily and relentless. Shanice turned the work into a rite of patience. The machete in her hand moved with precision, as if each cut bundle were a compass for the maturing plan. At dusk, when the others returned with their bodies hunched and breathing heavily, she remained a moment longer in the sugarcane field, pretending to adjust the strap-on her foot. She observed the mansion high on the hillside, windows that reflected cold light, the veranda where Beatrice would pass her scented handkerchief before taking afternoon tea. The lady seemed indifferent, haughty, secure in her wooden and lace throne. She didn't notice that this woman, inferior in her eyes, was plotting a sentence of no return. Over the next few nights, Shanice moved with the caution of someone who knows every path on the mill. She learned to listen to the whistling of the wind as if it were a secret language. When the lamps in the main house burned low, Beatrice would close the curtains. When the estate dog howled, the servants knew their master had seen the dawn. It was on this map of habits that Shanice plotted the route of action. She collected ropes used to tie the bundles and hid them under the rags on her head. She kept a worn piece of iron, torn from a broken gear in the mill, in the pocket of her skirt. At night, sitting on the cold floor of the slave quarters while the others slept, she sharpened the metal on a piece of stone until the sparks lit her face for brief breaths. Each spark seemed to say, "Now." The hunger that had previously dominated her was converted into sharp patience. She avoided talking about her plans for fear of being overheard. She had seen the overseer's severity with any hint of conspiracy. Silence became her uniform. When someone innocently asked if she was okay, Shanice would respond with only a discreet nod, as if to say, "I am." Inside, however, the hours were counted with military precision. She memorized the overseer's routes, the times the horses were fed, the holes where the wagon's bottoms hid the outlines of tools. She knew surprise would be her only advantage. Hatred wasn't the only thing in his plan. There was calculation and also a kind of ritual that prepared it. On moonlit nights, he would whisper to the small yoke he still kept, as if asking permission from his ancestors. He would touch the wood of the central beam with his fingertips and murmur, "Forgive me, Mother, but I can't bury this inside me." In a low voice, so that not even his own shadow would betray him, he would comment on the routines he observed. When the master eats, the back window is left open. The overseer always leaves the rod on the rack. The service door doesn't lock with a key on Tuesday nights. These repetitions were lifeblood. They transformed fear into a script. She prepared instruments with the dexterity of someone forced to repair anything that broke on the farm. The rusted iron was filed, transformed into a raw blade, capable of ripping apart whatever was necessary. The ropes, once tied in hidden knots, could become nooses or restraints. She planned the moment, the absence of witnesses, the way the house could be invaded without calling guards. Above all, without allowing the gesture to die amidst confessions. "If I'm caught, let it be quick," she whispered to herself, as if accepting the price of the act. Acceptance, however, did not appease the thirst for justice that consumed her. It only strengthened her resolve. The days multiplied the vigil. At noon, when the sun beat down hardest on her back and the mill screeched, Shanice would pretend to stumble to extend the minutes she could spend watching the back door of the manor house. She noticed that Beatrice, one afternoon, brought a note from Montego Bay that left her more taciturn than usual. She noted the gesture in her secret memory notebook. She also noticed that, in meetings between gentlemen, there was a slurred laughter, and that this time of distraction could open the gap she needed. The right moment, she thought, would be when the voices were many and the gazes were scattered. Even with her heart constantly on the verge of bursting, Shanice reserved small gestures of humanity that kept her from becoming a mere hate machine. On the way back, whenever she saw a child from the slave quarters sleeping, she would run, the palm of her hand over the boy's face, as if testing if there was still human warmth beneath the harshness of the work. And these pauses were fuel. They reminded her of who she was fighting for. The revenge she planned wasn't for herself. It was for the echo that would remain in the bowels of that plantation, so that no one could ever again call the death an innocent coincidence. Some nights, Beatrice's shadow would loom long over the floor of the manor house, and Shanice would feel the seams of her body tighten with anxiety. With each step she took, the fabric of the plan was silently woven together. It had to be perfect. It had to be infallible, not out of pride, but out of necessity. If she failed, the shackles would not only bind her, but would make her resistance a warning, and Kwame's memory might be trampled to dust. Better, then, that the act be as final as the loss she had suffered. One early morning, as she finished sharpening another blade, Shanice murmured to the iron as, if confessing to an invisible court, it will be now. I will not lose another life here. Her voice was short, tense, but firm. She knew she could not back down. The plan that had settled in her head like a millstone was ready to turn, and in that silence that only the breeze from the sugarcane field dared disturb, the woman who no longer wept for herself raised her eyes to the manor house and saw, behind the closed windows, the figure of the lady, aloof, proud, unaware that the sentence had been written in the shadows she had ignored. If this cruelty revolted you, say now, enough silence. Let us show together that this pain will not be erased. After 3 days of enforced silence and accumulated grief, Shanice seemed like just another shadow among the sugarcane fields. But within her, a fire grew that could no longer be contained. She observed every detail of the farmhouse routine and knew that Mrs. Beatrice suffered from insomnia, that she wandered into the kitchen in the early hours of the morning to make tea. That night, when the foreman slept and the farm was plunged into stillness, Shanice waited until the clock struck 2 in the morning. She walked firmly into the kitchen, the cloth tied around her head, and said in a low voice, "Miss, I'll make your tea." Beatrice didn't answer. She simply stood tall, waiting. As the water boiled and the scent of cloves spread, Shanice approached. When the lady turned her back, Shanice grabbed her blonde hair with the force. Of all the pain gnawing at her, Beatrice tried to scream, but a makeshift cloth gag muffled the sound. The lady was dragged down the hallway to a secluded room, out of earshot of any servants. Beatrice struggled, furious at the enslaved woman's audacity, and even gagged. She tried to threaten with arrogant gestures and eyes. Shanice, however, did not back down. "I've suffered enough. You took away my reason for living. Now my son will be avenged." The words came out firmly, unhurriedly, like a sentence. Inside the room, a central beam spanned the ceiling. Shanice tied the woman's hair to the beam and suspended her, forcing her to writhe in pain. Time passed slowly, and muffled moans filled the space that once smelled of perfume and tea. For half an hour, Beatrice felt the weight of helplessness. Shanice, motionless, watched with a cold smile and said, "This is nothing compared to what you did to my son." When she finally made up her mind, she advanced with the strength of someone who had nothing left to lose. She ripped off the lady's clothes, leaving her exposed and vulnerable, and ripped off her mistress's breasts with her bare hands. Beatrice's pain filled the room, turning it into a judgment seat. She moaned and writhed in pain, already fainting, while Shanice glared at her with hatred and said, "Now you'll never be a mother again." Her muffled screams mingled with heavy breathing as the lady's body racked with agony. The room, once perfumed and filled with symbols of power, became a place of horror and punishment. There was no hierarchy here, only the raw justice of a woman who had lost everything. Shanice didn't cry, didn't tremble. The pain had turned to steel, and that night she forever etched the price of cruelty into the plantation's memory. What else had happened to the slave now? If the cry of a mother like Shanice also echoed in your heart, leave just one word in the comments: pain. With his hands still stained, Shanice ran into the woods without looking back. He knew every shortcut in Palm Grove, like someone who memorizes the cracks in a prison. The narrow trail behind the sugar mill, the old ditch that leads to the marsh, the bend in the river where the water deepens and erases footprints. He slid down the side of the hibiscus, crossed the lawn in silence, and entered the dark corridor of sugarcane, where the leaves cut the skin like thin blades. There, he bent down, broke through the stalks, and continued, trying to leave the smallest trace. When he reached the water, he walked in the shallow riverbed for a few meters to confuse dogs and men. Then he climbed toward the scrub that points to the limestone mountains of the interior, a maze of ravines and sinkholes that the elders called Maroon Country. At dawn, the farm woke askew. The gong rang, but no one found Mrs. Beatrice to give orders. The kitchen, still scented with cloves, had a cold teapot abandoned on the table. The maids were surprised by her absence. They knocked on doors, called out names. Foreman Hugh came first, irritated. Mason followed, stick in hand. They tried the doorknob to the back room, but it wouldn't budge. After a struggle and a struggle with keys, the bolt broke from the inside. What they saw paralyzed the hallway. No one spoke in detail. They spoke in panic. "Call Mr. Arthur," someone said hoarsely. The master arrived in his robe and paled as if he'd been pushed against a wall. The big house fell silent in a way no one had ever remembered. Seeing, the news spread through the yard like wildfire. The woman dead, the terrifying scene, the house gripped with fear. Suddenly, work stopped. The sheaves didn't rise, the mill didn't groan, the pans didn't hum sugar. Palm Grove, which had always followed the rhythm of production, now moved to the beat of fear. Arthur Langley ordered a search. Dogs were brought from the corral, men swept the lawn and the riverbank, descended the hibiscus trail, and entered the tall cane, calling the enslaved. Woman's name with insults. They found inconsistent marks, a thread of cloth caught on a thorn, a boot sunk in the fresh mud, footprints that ended in shallow water. As the dogs began to spin aimlessly, Hugh spat on the ground and said softly, "To no one. She can walk." Outside, the river flowed on indifferently, but those who lived there no longer viewed it the same way. For the manor house, that bank became a reminder of what they had lost: control, authority, the comfort of knowing everything. Obeys. For the slave quarters, the river held another word: passage. As dusk fell, armed groups climbed the slope toward the forest, carrying lanterns, machetes, and fear clinging to their backs. The terrain of Jamaica, broken and alive, swallows footsteps easily. In certain stretches, the earth gives way, the vegetation closes in. Sounds deceiving. Pierce, a hastily hired free laborer, swore he heard hurried footsteps above, like those of a woman. When they reached the spot, there was only silence and the smell of damp earth. It was in this gap that the stories emerged. Some said the forest parted to receive her, as if the larger leaves discreetly inclined their heads to let her pass. A kitchen girl swore that in the still dawn darkness she saw a figure crossing the sugarcane field with something on its chest. It seemed to be carrying a baby, she whispered, and crossed her arms to ward off the shiver. Others claimed the rivers changed course for an instant, creating a backwater, where the current had once rushed, erasing footprints and sweeping away any sign. Some swore they saw her among the maroons, tall on the trail, her eyes burning, an invisible child clutched in her lap, as if memory had become a real weight. And there were those, more superstitious, who said the earth of cockpit country swallows what it seeks to protect. The ground itself took her, they murmured, turned her into shadow. In the slave quarters, the murmur grew louder. Aunt Ruth, who watched over the children, spent the night with her hands clasped together, repeating names like someone stitching up wounds. Shanice, Kwame. A young man, recently returned from another plantation, asked if it was true that the Maroons welcomed runaways. The older men answered without looking directly, "It depends on the price the person has already paid." There are pacts that cannot be explained aloud. From the courtyard windows, some women held their own children tightly, as if they wanted to press them to their chests forever. There was fear of the whipping and the siege to come, but also a burning pride that no one dared confess. In the main house, mourning didn't behave as it does in the portraits. The body was hurriedly carried away, the curtains drawn, the piano closed. Arthur issued orders in a stern voice, but the orders fell to the floor like lead. Beatrice, who never brooked interruptions, was now an interruption in everything. In every task, in every open window, in every glance that strayed from the back hallway. No one slept well that night of forced vigil, and the questions, which the farm had never asked itself, began to surface with the stubbornness of the tide. Who rules when fear changes sides? What happens when a mother has nothing left to lose? Early in the morning, the search resumed, this time with men from neighboring properties. They climbed the creek line, searched the marsh, and marked trees with knives to avoid circling. Every so often they found signs that might have belonged to Shanice: a knot in a branch, a handprint in the mud, the absence of any sound in the area where birds normally squawk. But the trail broke, reappeared, and disappeared again. A cowboy pointed to the blue ridge on the horizon and said, "If you've entered the heart of the rocks, you won't come out unless you want to." No one laughed. By the end of the second day, fatigue weighed more heavily than machetes. The sun was beating down behind the poles, and Palm Grove seemed to have shrunk in fear. Shanice was nowhere, and for that very reason everywhere. She was in the glass of water someone offered with a trembling hand. She was in the door that would creak forever. She was in the stretch of river where no one else wanted to bathe. Her story, which began as a whisper, became a boundary line. On one side, those who still believed in the whip. On the other, those who learned that certain pains, when silenced, return in the form of a sentence. In the accounting, Records the blue notebook gained a thick line on the day's page, but no word explained what befell the farm. On people's lips, however, a phrase repeated itself with variations, spanning nights and generations. The mother fled, and the earth kept her. For some, a miracle. For others, a threat. For those who lost children before they learned their own name, a warning. There are silences that protect. There are shadows that liberate. After all this, do you think you met the end you deserved? Comment yes or no. I want to hear your opinion. To this day, no one knows for sure where Shanice died, or if she died at all. Some swear she lived among the Maroons until her final days. Others say she transformed into a shadow, and that her presence still haunts the rivers and plantations of Jamaica. The truth is that her absence was never complete. It was etched not in paper, but in blood, in whispers, and in fear. Etched in the chants of the women in the slave quarters, in the eyes of mothers who lost children, in the heavy silence that fell over Palm Grove after that dawn. Shanice wasn't just a mother who lost her son. She was a mother who turned her loss into a verdict against her oppressors, her body transformed into a sentence, her scream transformed into history. She didn't ask for justice, she wrote it with her own hands, and this gesture has spanned generations. That's why her name doesn't need to be in books, because it lives in the memories of those who don't look away, in the hearts that understand that a mother's love can become the most relentless weapon against cruelty. Stories like Shanice's don't appear in books, but they survive in the voices of those who dare to remember. And now I want to know, what part of this story impacted you the most? Write in the comments, because every word you say is a way of keeping this memory alive. And if you thought this story was powerful, wait until you see the video now appearing on your screen. There, I'll reveal another story even more hidden, even more forbidden, that will make you question everything you thought you knew about slavery. Click now, but prepare yourself, because what you're about to hear is unforgettable.